So I'm apologising in advance for what I'm going to talk about because so we've been talking about a lot of technology and materials and projects, and and that's what I usually talk about. And this time I really wanted us to talk about the way we do the buildings and the way that the industry, which kind of holds us all, influences us into working in ways which are not necessarily producing the results that we are looking for. So I spent quite a bit of time, and I really wanted to do this, but I found it really hard to do, and I spent quite a bit of time reading the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report, and it's forensic, the detail, and what it tells us is how everybody in the design and building process failed to notice, understand, or take responsibility for the work that they were doing. And this is direct quote from the report. And I think it's quite hard. In one way, it's sort of like we know more about why that happened, but it is quite hard for us to understand what happened, that it could happen, and also that it's happening within the kind of procurement and employment and tendering processes that we are currently working in. So that's really what I kind of wanted to focus on. So, and I'm sorry, there's a lot of text here, but what do we know? We know from the report that Arconic knew from 2005 that the only available test evidence had the potential to react and fire in an extremely dangerous way. And despite that, they persisted in telling the market that it conformed, regardless of the form in which it was used. So that was absolutely directly misinformation on a massive scale. If we look at the cladding that's being used across the country, how powerful that was. And we also know that that Kingspan, and I know quite a few people in the AECB who have had their own kind of encounters with Kingspan over the years. But they marketed this K15 product between 2006 and 2019. They went on and they marketed it, and it was a deeply entrenched and persistent dishonesty in pursuit of commercial gain, coupled with a complete disregard for fire safety. We don't know yet how the corruption spread to BRE, which I personally think should be just closed down, but BRE and also the government. And the report says there are three possibilities. The first is that those in the government who were responsible for the research project did not read it carefully or appreciate its implications. The second is that they did read it, but did not understand the full seriousness of the implications. And the third is that they understood the seriousness of the implications and they decided to suppress it. Sorry, I'm not succeeding here. Nice. No, it's gone back. Okay. So at the same time, in August, the negotiation for the UN Treaty on plastic pollution collapsed. And that was, it was sabotaged by a small group of oil-producing nations. And there's a direct link between that, what happened in August, and what happened at Grenfell. So the other thing is that we can see from the inquiry is that people were kind of going along with something which others seemed to think was okay. And none of those involved in the design of the external wall acted in accordance with the standards of a reasonably competent person. They failed to identify their own responsibilities, and everyone involved in the choice of materials to be used thought that the responsibility for the suitability and safety lay with someone else. So, and we can also see, oh God, sorry, I can't cope with this. We can see the same kind of thing about going along with what's going on happened in the report, February 2017, the inquiry into the Edinburgh schools disaster, where fortunately, and by enormous luck, nobody was killed. And the report says, it's the unequivocally held view of the inquiry, there were fundamental and widespread failures of the quality assurance in all the various contractors and subcontractors who were part of this big kind of private finance initiative schools. And then, you know, this year, we find that more than 30,000 UK homes had botched insulation fitted under the government Eco4 and the Great British Insulation Scheme. And the Energy Consumer Minister described it as systemic failure. And I think, you know, we really need to sort of, take on. That's what's going on. Investigation into corruption. And there's been quite a lot of work on this. And I think this is quite an interesting recent report, which looks at when corruption happens. And interestingly, the most susceptible stage is the pre-construction stage, when we know that's where all the key decisions happen. That's the time when the most corrupt practices happen most often, and it's including favoritism, nepotism, patronage, conflict of interest, and professional negligence. And then what comes up quite a lot is this idea of the primary barrier is actually industry culture. And I think that is another really important thing for us to think about. So there's been quite a bit of government response, and obviously the Building Safety Act in particular, but also a sort of focus on quality. And there's this new Construction Products Reform Green Paper, which you know, quotes Hackett saying the system that covers product testing, labeling and marketing is at least as complicated as the entire regulatory regime. So there is work going on there. RICS have also come up with some sort of responses. The RIBA talks about quality, and just more recently, a specific response to the Grenfell Inquiry report, which does talk about independent research and development. I mean, a direct response, I think, to the absolutely shocking part of the inquiry, which is about BRE. And I think that, you know, that word independent is really critical. So what needs to change? So we know the way that the moment the industry protects, encourages, and allows corrupt and unethical behaviour because it's trying to offload risk, reduce cost, and sell products irrespective of how appropriate they are. And the practice of tendering projects to multiple contractors or inviting competitive proposals locks firms in unproductive work. The practice of taking the lowest price rather than the one which pays appropriately for the work to be done encourages work to be done badly. The focus on initial price rather than eventual cost leads to more costly redoing, repairing of work, or lack of repair, even worse. The lack of holistic education in the industry means people on site not understanding the work of their colleagues, as well as buying and using materials and construction assembles which are unsafe, bad for the environment. The whole-scale practice of subcontracting means employees don't benefit from good, consistent employment practices and benefits. And the difficulties of managing the fragmentation with the industry means managers become bullies, and many individuals fear to speak out. So we've talked, I mean, all of these things have come up today, actually, and the first thing, challenging the role of class and culture, is, you know, people have mentioned already, talked about this, how we've got this on-site, off-site complete split, which is to do with the rooted class system, which is still so endemic in the industry. And we know that what we all need is to understand better the work that other people do. And that is in particularly crucial across site and off-site. You know, designers don't spend enough time on site, and site people don't spend enough time at the desk. And that's something we've talked about, but I don't think we've really focused on that as a sort of something that we really, as a collective community, should be really thinking about how we tackle profoundly. We talked about knowledge and teaching and training, and how patchy that is, and how much it's not valued. The skill of technical on-site work isn't valued properly. And employment conditions and benefits, you know, obviously the scale is really important, but it's something that we are all involved with and do have some agency in there. And then the commissioning of buildings, and James talks so well about this, about who develops the brief. And, you know, when is competition useful? Has it really understood what the brief is? Can you actually do competitions if you haven't actually had an opportunity to really talk to the people who are going to be using the building? And then there's tendering and building on site, and that kind of process. And so what I thought was we'd just talk about a couple of examples. So now I've really depressed everybody. We just talk about a couple of examples, and then have a better kind of general conversation. So first of all, on the brief, that thing of really thinking about, which again, I won't go on to extensively talk about this, but how you don't wait for people to come to you. You actually got to look at all the different ways that you can go to them. And then I just wanted to talk, this is an Enefit retrofit project of a 1960s, 70s building, which it seemed to be a pretty straightforward kind of wrapping it up kind of retrofit, but actually, of course, turned out not to be straightforward at all. And so we used, and we had, quite a really informed client. And the key thing about the informed client was that they understood that they needed to take on the risk, and that for them to take on the risk at the beginning was a less risky option than to try and offload the risk later on and end up with a poor product, which they then couldn't really cope with doing something with later. So that, I think, in my experience, that is pretty unusual. And so what that meant was that they were prepared to do all the detailed work at the beginning, the really detailed survey work, not just of the not just the engineering, not just the structural work, but also services work, and really kind of understand what are the kind of key problems. And then we, because the sort of the biggest challenge was, as the airtightness, of course, and so we did kind of workshops with all the designers quite carefully through that process. And then we set up a two-stage tendering process. So the first stage, we interviewed 5 who were invited to tender. And that first stage tender, which was a post-planning stage with key construction details, but not fully detailed. It was a price document with an estimated budget, and it was had detailed preliminaries for pricing. And the requirement was to tender on preliminaries, to comment on the design proposals, those kind of outline proposals, and to review and agree indicative costs and accept the budget as achievable, an achievable second stage tender sum. And they had to include all their costs for arriving at the second stage tender return, and include engaging with us in the whole design process. They had to demonstrate an open book basis on the subcontractors that they were using, mainly service subcontractors, and then the programme of the work to start on site. And so the second stage, Tembersun, was done on completed design drawings. So they were completed through this process of discussion about the different methods that we could use to achieve benefit, resulting in the second stage of the construction method and budget revisions. And I mean, we were really lucky. This particular contract worked really well. And we had a very good airtightness champion on site, excellent site management, a very efficient contractor, engaged subcontractors who had been involved in the design discussions and knew what they were doing, and fees for on-site weekly project architect. At the end of it, I asked the site manager what difference it made that we'd been through this process, and he said, normally I start on site on the first day with all the drawings, and I haven't really had time to look at them. And in this case, I started on site, I knew everything about how the process was going to go. I knew what the critical path was. I knew who the subcontractors who I was going to be working with, I knew they knew what they were doing. And it changed the way I managed this project on site completely. So that's one example. I just wanted to say just one other thing really about, why does actually building matter? Because I feel we've got, the designers, sometimes we've got so far away from actually making things. And this process of doing the straw bale building, which we did at the community centre in Tottenham, and then again on my house that some of you came to see yesterday, really sort of demonstrated something which I've also experienced working with self-build groups on self-build projects, which is this way in which building work can actually be transformational. And there are so many of us, so many people are kind of quite practical, but don't have the opportunity to do anything about changing their environment. And working with residents and community groups and this kind of thing, just really reinforce that sense of the way that we interact with our environment, and by actually participating in the construction of it, take ownership in such a different way, so that this building, in the middle of a park where everyone said, oh, you can't possibly do that, it'll get vandalized, has not been vandalized over the 15 years since it was built. And the kind of comments from people who are working on it afterwards about this sense of, when it's finished, yeah, I'll be coming here, I'll be coming to the cafe, and I'll say, I built that wall. That's so important. And it's not just important in this way, it's also important in how, for all of us, in how we contribute to the projects that we are part of. And so that's my first sort of example. And Jay's just going to talk about something else, and then we wanted to have another kind of discussion. Can you have, do you want to have one of these? All right.
Yeah. Can you just share? Can you hear me on this, or is it on? It's not. It is on?
No.
Is it on now? Yes. It is on now? Yeah. And Fran, yeah, if you could just do this. Yeah, if you could do the switching. All right, when Fran and I were talking about this between us, and we were talking about a systemic change, and we did these two houses that some of you have seen yesterday at Hickling, and they sit adjacent to Fran's own house, which is the straw bale. And she was saying, she built that straw bale house. It was for her and Gil, and it was something she was very interested in. It was very bespoke to her, and they love living in it. But then they built these two houses next door, and she approached us and said, I think this will be a good project for you guys, for PH15. And then she'd found some timber framers. And she said, I think they're really good local guys. They've had a bad experience with timber frame. I think it'd be good if they had a good experience. And, you know, we'll put this team together. And basically, Fran was trying to say, I don't want people coming in, building something poorly, adjacent to my house, and I'll be gnashing my teeth as I look at them. So we want to build with all our environmental outcomes non-negotiable. We want to put 2 good homes. We're going to sell them. And as long as I don't lose money, we're happy. And that's exactly what happened. And we built them, and they reflect the local vernacular. And I think I sort of just forgot about them, as you do with projects. And then I came across a little film of somebody who'd bought it, and he was doing sort of promotion. He was so excited about his house. And there was a little picture of him, and he was in front of candles, and he said, I can heat my house with candles. And I thought, well, I'm not sure you can do that, but maybe you're living at a slightly lower temperature. And he had some inaccuracies in his description about the house, but he'd had his life so radically impacted by buying that house. And I thought, that's an investment in. And this is what Fran is good at doing, at making an investment in. And then that's an investment in for 60 to 100 years, isn't it? And where we start with Passive House is this slide here, just showing here all the things that we're meant to be doing for future homes and the problem of climate change, which is where a lot of us have started with our businesses. And of course, it's a systemic answer. There's lots and lots of aspects to it. And then there's also the fact that it's been a systemic problem. So how did we get here? It's a systemic issue. And then Passive House, as you see, the way we run our business is we found a systemic solution versus just singular. And a lot of ways people talk about systems is it's just a singular. So they call something a system, but it's actually only one bit of the puzzle and one bit of the puzzle. And they refer to that as a system, but it's not. It's just a singular product. And really, we're about trying to disrupt business as usual. And it's not so much about we choosing to build a passive house in our case, but it's actually how am I going to build that passive house? And it's whatever it is that you're doing. It's a much more complex question. This is a slide just quickly with all the things that Fran and I talked about in terms of the current systems, all the things that we bump up against because we do things differently. And I've started to highlight which things we can feel the tension between us and those things. For some reason, there's the titles gone from that slide, but there's the architect, and you can go back, Fran.
Oh, sorry.
There's the architect, there's the builder, there's the QS, there's the client. And basically, the current systemic processes just do not embed quality. They do not embed equality. And then underneath that, they also, and this I've experienced through my career, there's this upsurge of you get anger and aggression, you get low trust levels, you get stress levels arising in people. And this is just one problem that I see again and again and again in what we do, just as an example. So the systemic problem is standard UK timber frames getting modified upwards versus redesign from first principles. And if you redesign from first principles, you resolve so many things. I put all the list of things that we have potential to resolve when we redesign from first principles. But actually, there's so many systemic barriers to doing that, from tendering procedures, through profit avenues for the main contractor, and simplistic early costing assessments, all sorts of things that come in and make that not happen. And I have to say that every project we've been asked to comment on, where there's been problems, and we've gone in as technical advisors, modification upward has been one of the major issues. Where do we do well? We do well at the edges. This is a sort of one-off discerning client. And here's somebody who's built a Passive House Plus at a very good cost point, but they're not in the current system. They've already questioned it. They're already sitting outside it. Back again, there's another group we do quite well with, which is actually a growing number of architects who are very interested in high environmental design, as well as architecture with a capital A. So here they are wanting to push timber frame right to its edges, and then they'll see the value of doing things differently and they'll buck the system. And they're still being able to do that at quite a good price point as well. Where we have problems is the mainstream, and this is where we want scalable change. And we always came into this from the beginning, I did, wanting scalable change. In the mainstream, we've done a couple of projects, but what interests me in those projects is they were both procured slightly differently. And I'm just going to talk about one of them because of time, which is the Ackerman Road, and that's because we did it with Fran. And that definitely happened in different ways. And Lambeth Council was their first social housing to Passive House standard, and they definitely stepped out of their current systems in order to procure that and make it happen. And there was a huge amount of trust between Fran and the council that enabled that to happen. And there was a particular person in there. She just disagreeing how much trust there was, but I felt there was quite a bit. And this is the scalable change that I would love to see, that we were inspired for, which was sort of rooted in the Victorian house revolution that built for longevity at a time when house building was a socially admired profession. It was a living revolution and a social reform, places like Saltaire. And that's the sort of thing I would love to see. And we're all here, I hope, not just to do work around the edges, but we want to make scalable change. And that means we have to think about reform. We have to think about being change makers. And we have to think about being systemic in our thinking and how we can work to change those systems. And now Fran's just going to talk to this slide.
Oh, just to say that, I think the AECB is a great community. I think we can support each other, and I think we do that. I think we could think more about how we could do this in terms of the systemic relationships. And I think that the industry is under a lot of pressure to change now. I think the Grenville work has been shocking to a lot of people. And I think that government and institutions are really asking for change. So that, I think we know what these changes, we do know what these changes have to be. So it's about how we, in everything we do, look, is this a place where we can push for doing this differently? Is this, where are the opportunities? And so I thought that's what we really should be talking about.
We had a few questions at the end about being change makers and disruptors. And there's some questions there. And we did think, is there anything, as we discussed together, that I could commit to change in my current work? Is there something at the end of this conference we could think about? I think actually there is a matter that I could actually make a change about.